Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage Errant Book 5, The Siege of Skyhold, chapters 26 through 31. Heart of the Splinter, Cloud Formations, Needles, The Scent of Magic, Spirits and Elementals, and Nesting Instincts. In these chapters, Sabae is experimenting with some new stuff about her magic and the way that she's combining things. We learn more about scent affinities, and we also have a kind of breakdown coming from Hugh. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you so much to Dan for commissioning this episode. Dan is here in the chat and just commissioned the final book in the series, so we are all sewed up. And I'm pretty excited about that. I always feel like really particularly gratified when I get to finish a complete series. There's just a feeling about it of like, there, and I can put it on the shelf and look at it and be like, and that is done. MX Shard is here as well. Hello. So yeah, these chapters, there's a lot of like personal stuff happening that I thought was pretty interesting, and I will I'm going to do my best to really keep on task with this recording, because you know how I can just sort of wander off verbally and then find myself with 10 minutes and 3 chapters to go. So we start off chapter 26 with Hugh in the Grand Library, and we get some really cool descriptions here, and I obviously can't just like read you the whole description, but one of my favorite parts was a description about some books that are like alive. They have bark covers and living leaves as the pages in the book. And there's also a really good one, a pond that has frogs in it. And the bottom of the pond appeared to have a number of full bookshelves lying flat, filled with oddly glimmering volumes. As far as he knew, all the library's volumes that needed to be kept underwater were meant for saltwater readers. He wasn't aware they kept any freshwater books, or know who could possibly need them. And he definitely wasn't aware of any saltwater frogs, so they almost were certainly freshwater books. Bizarre. And I'm like, is that the bizarre part? That they're not saltwater? Or is it bizarre that there are just books that are only for underwater? I am going to go with that second one. I'm just saying, Hugh. I also like that there's a mention of the further down you go, the fewer books that are on the shelves until eventually you pass through areas where there are whole empty bookshelves. And I am really, really curious about whether or not those are actually empty. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, for example, in Harry Potter, you have the restricted section, right? Where you can only go in and get a book out if you have a written permission slip from a teacher. And if you open a book without being given permission, like one of the books in the library, when he opens it, just starts screaming. And it's unclear whether that's just a feature of that book or if that's a security measure or what. But I'm wondering if like maybe some of these shelves that look empty are filled with books that are extremely dangerous. And so you need to get permission in order to see them. And maybe if you got permission, you go down there and only the book you were given permission to see is visible. And none of the other books, like there's nothing else showing up. It's just a lone bookshelf with your one book on it. So that's just my little headcanon idea that I'm going to go with for now because I like it. So eventually he gets to Kandaron's lair, and we have a sort of interesting moment here. He sees her staring at the exile splinter. And when he disturbs her, she turns around and has a kind of like wild look on her face. And doesn't seem to recognize him and gets pretty defensive. And her immediate reaction, like she, as soon as she has a beat and recognizes him, she apologizes for coming across so like aggressively. And I am going to assume like she would have been taken by surprise by anybody coming down here. As we find out, he literally just asked for a way down to her lair and the codex gave him one, but that is really not supposed to be how that works. And the codex, she accuses it of deciding that she is lonely and thus giving him permission, which she is like saying that's not true. But I think methinks the lady doth protest too much. I think that not only is it able to tell that she is indeed lonely, but that it is also perhaps she says that because it's connected to her mind. And she says, not even properly sapient, and you're trying to meddle in my social schedule. And I should have stuffed a pigeon's mind in there instead. The index continued to not respond in any way. I'm wondering how much the index is aware of her fixating on the exile splinter and low-key being like, hey girl, maybe you want to back off on that a little bit? What do you think? I want to talk to somebody who's a person standing here who's a friend instead of staring at this like magical object continually like you've been doing for several hours, just for instance. And I'm really like guessing here. That's, but there is something about her staring when Hugh walks in that feels like she's been there for a minute, and like she's lost track of time, and that this is not the first time that she has done that. The fact that the splinter is even out is not wise. And she admits when he's like, I think you should really put that away. She gets super defensive again and then sort of catches herself and is like, no, you're right. It's very, very dumb of me to have this out here. And I was shocked, to be honest, that he walks into her lair and it's just out and she's looking at it. I never expected for the exile splinter to just be chilling in an open, like, granted, it's not like just anybody could get here, I don't think, but it's an open enough area. You know what I'm saying? Like, I understand that Kandaron herself is a security system to a degree, but it, just seems like, well, what happened? Does she just, if she's going to go and speak to somebody, she just leave it there? What's she doing with it? And she says something fascinating to me, because I'm thinking she's attempting to just like get back her memories of her family like she was talking about. And she says, it's so tempting, the idea of abandoning the weight of centuries, turning back into the feral monster I was in the decades after the fall of Ithos, becoming the mad sphinx again. And y'all, Hugh does not ask her about this. Is that weird to anybody else? Like, that's a wild thing she just said. And he doesn't say anything. It immediately goes to her saying, but I can't afford it. I have too many plans. Hugh breathed his own sigh of relief as Kandaron tucked the exile splinter into some extraplanar space. And I'm like, dude, are you not gonna like ask her about being the mad sphinx and being feral after the fall of like, what? I understand that her memories were affected. I did not know that was the result, that she lost memories to the degree that she became like almost like not self-aware anymore. So it's just a weird moment where she says that and then the Sphinx sighed, and then, but I cannot afford it. There is no indication of reaction from Hugh whatsoever. And I don't know what to make of it, because I would think he would have some kind of thought. And even when they move on to the next part of the conversation and she's asking him about himself, it's not on his mind at all, and he doesn't think about it later on in the chapters either. It's like she says it and he doesn't hear it. It's like it didn't happen. It's bizarre. And I can't tell if that's like the writing being just sort of wonky, or if I'm supposed to notice that Hugh doesn't seem surprised by it at all. I don't know what to make of it, but it really bugged me that there's nothing to indicate he even heard her. It's really, really weird. Dan says shocked silence, it seemed like. There is no indication there was any silence. There is no indication that there is shock. Nothing of the kind. If you read that section, she just says this stuff and moves on, and then is like, how are you doing? Hugh's just like, I'm all right. That's it. It's real weird. So I just felt like, you know, we don't know a lot about Candaron. She doesn't share about herself that often. And when she does, I pay really close attention, because I'm wondering all the time whether or not to trust her. And I couldn't believe that she said something so wild and he just doesn't pursue it. I mean, even if he asked somebody else about it later because he didn't feel comfortable asking her directly, but it's like it never happened. Anyway, so I just had to talk about it because I was like really distracted by it. And the rest of the conversation, I think, is supposed to be kind of funny because of the way she's asking him about himself. But I was so preoccupied with what she'd said and waiting for him to come back to it and ask her about it. And it never happened. So I just didn't fully like absorb. But the rest of the conversation, she is just, how are you? How are events treating you and your friends? And then eventually, it is normal to ask about your health now. Yes. And I do enjoy that. As much as Hugh is sort of like, this is weird the way that she's doing this, he doesn't like say anything outwardly to let Candaron know that this is sort of funny. He just goes with her attempts to engage with him in a way that I feel like is kind of respectful of the fact that, look, she's being honest with you that she doesn't really know what she's doing and that she's uncomfortable and trying her best, and he's not making it harder for her. You know, he is attempting to engage with her on the level that she is comfortable with right now. And I really appreciated that, because I think if I were him, I would have been tempted to be like, really? Do you have like a list? Did somebody give you an assignment? Like, I would have been a little bit teasing. And when I step back and look at it, I'm like, I think that would be the wrong call here. She's trying, you know, she really is. And he starts talking about, I'm kind of getting to a place of diminishing returns with my ward studies. I've covered most of the general theories, so what I'm learning from Lorna is teaching me either highly specialized or highly debated. And I really enjoy the debated. I'm like, let's hear more about that. So outside of my armor project, I've been focusing a little more on spell form. And he mentions, I'm not as good at it as you acted like I was, and it's not as hard as you and Alustin said. And Candaron is like blushing and says, look, when you came down here, you were so worried. I wanted to give you a little something to pump you up and make you feel like you were, you know, and like I exaggerated a little, but you are pretty good at it, and it isn't an easy thing. I mean, you know, I made it more of a thing, but I'm going to stand by it. And she gets a little bit more red, and then he leans on her and says, "Thank you." And she seems truly touched by it. It's a cute moment. So then we go to 27, Sabae. And this is her figuring out how to combine the techniques that she's got going on. And it's a really fun thing because she's like, so I'm combining air and water in a way that I should have thought of because of high weather. And I'm like, oh, right. So she's like making clouds, which is a very cool idea. And Godric is the one who chimes in and is like, you're combining them into clouds. And again, guys, I just want to point out, like, so, you know, saying earlier that I would have teased Candoron a little bit, and that's probably not the right response. Right here, Godric interrupts to say clouds, and Sabae smiled and nodded at him. Is she irritated that he interrupted and just stole her thunder? No, she's delighted that he has figured it out. I would have been annoyed because I'm not a good person. I want the drama of explaining. I'm much more of an Alustan than I like to think I am. So it's just a moment where, like, she pauses and looks at him, and I'm waiting for her to be like, come on, man, really? And no, she smiles, and I was like, oh, yikes, girl, Tosh. This is something that has come up for me. Have you guys watched Jury Duty? Jury Duty, for those who are not familiar, is a show that I think was on Freevee. I don't remember, but I watched it through Amazon Prime. And it is a reality show where only one person is aware, or only one person thinks it's a documentary, and everybody else involved is an actor. And they're all playing like a particular type of character. And this person is walking into this weird situation where they're on jury duty with some real weirdos. And the story he's been told is that he's being filmed for a documentary on like the judicial process and what jury duty is like for people and what people run into. So the whole thing is that they picked somebody who seemed like a good person, and they watched them interact and react with people. And you guys, this dude is such a sweetie pie and so patient and so kind. Like every moment that you have with him in front of like somebody who's being real strange, and he is just warm and listening and trying to be helpful. And all I could think was like, man, I would come across as a cunt if I were on this show. Like this, I am just kind of a bitch. I just am. And I have embraced that about myself for the most part. But, you know, there are times where it's like, maybe that's a fault. And you shouldn't just be like, I guess I'm just a bitch, and sit back and be okay with that. And there's nothing like seeing somebody react to a thing in a completely different way from you to sit back and make you go, oh man, maybe I've got a little bit of a temper, or maybe I'm kind of judgmental, or, you know, whatever. So anyway, watch Jury Duty, because what a sweetie. It's a really fun show. It's so sweet, and I just really loved it. And this moment with Sabae and just her being like, yay, my friend understands. I'm like, I should be more like that. What is wrong with me? So she is stepping into the pool of water to try and use that. And she is feeling the water carrying, or the wind carrying the water. And she's like, all right, yeah, I'm doing it. She's got her eyes closed. And then all of a sudden she hears everybody laughing, and she opens her eyes. And there's fog everywhere, and her body is covered in clouds. And she gets very annoyed by this because it's not what she wanted to do. And they all, like, somebody jumps in and names it, like, Fluffy Cloud Mode. I think it's Talia. But later on, there's a couple of uses for it that are pointed out. And I think it's Alustan who's like, you know, the most commonly used material for making mazes is fog, right? Or mist or something like that. this could come in super handy, I'm just saying. And I appreciated her getting a moment to sort of, you know, even though she didn't immediately accomplish what she intended, she inadvertently discovered something else that I bet will be kind of helpful. I think anything that like obscures vision, the main problem is it seems to obscure hers as well. And everybody that would be on her team probably also. But sometimes maybe all you need is to just not be quite visible easily. So she manages to make the armor, and let's see. Talia calls the armor she's doing Stormweave armor, and I think they come up with a different name. Godric says, I vote Tideweave, not Stormweave. And later on, there is like a Storm one that has a really, really different vibe. So, yeah, let's see. Okay, so Sabae took a deep breath and attempted to construct the layered armor on her arm again. It immediately detonated, but rather than letting it fly off, she yanked the wind and water back in again. And this is when Hugh's like, yeah, we're definitely calling that storm armor. He was staring at the dark, whirling clouds surrounding her arm. It looked even more ominous and aggressive than she remembered, with none of the absurdity of... She refused to call it Fluffy Cloud Mode. And I think eventually they decide on the name Fog Shroud, which is dope. It's just a good name. It's just a really good name. But yeah, the storm armor didn't extend quite as easily as the Tideweave armor had, but she managed to stretch it across most of her body without too much trouble, leaving only her head. This sounds super cool. And I just really want to... like this. So this is a thing I run into a lot, and I'm going to be covering Cradle later today, and I run into it with this as well. There are so many things that I'm like, I would love to see this on the big screen, like how they depict this. And then I'm like, it would just be such a total CGI fest. And that's not to say that there's a way to do this with practical effects necessarily, but you guys know what I mean, where when everything is CGI'd so heavily that it stops being impressive to look at. Do you get what I'm saying? It crosses over from being like really cool and engaging to like, oh, it's just a picture. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, my thought here was like, oh, I bet this would look so cool, like if I saw it in a movie. And then I was like, or it wouldn't really capture it at all. Not to say that they couldn't manage to do something with it, but sometimes too much effects makes you sort of like numb to the spectacle of a thing. Anyway, so Alessin says you're mixing your mana types. Your storm armor is being generated with wind and water mana mixed together into a solution. If you were using a spell form, it would be a bad thing. Individual types of mana have unique properties. Spell forms, for the most part, are designed for the properties of a single type of mana. And this is when Hugh is like, well, I thought some mages mixed mana. Godric was telling me about a mana technique that does that. And Godric chimes in very quickly. Yeah, my dad said that wasn't a good idea, though. So, and Alessin's like, yeah, it can explode. And like, you know, your father's armor, that'd be real bad. He says, I should also note there are some mages that use multiple mana types in a spell without mixing them, but that's more creating a pair of overlapping but non-intersecting spell forms. Useful, but incredibly difficult and taxing because you have to envision the spell forms in 3 dimensions, which just the envisioning a spell form in 1 dimension sounds pretty tough to me. You know, like I'm a very, very creative person and am able to conjure up images of what I'm going for when I design something. And I can't imagine a spell like that's a different thing, you know, that's too much. So they go for the next few hours testing all of this stuff. Mackerel is swimming in the pool and just being kind of annoying. And then there's one that she manages to do that she's blasting out water, and Godric names it the Tide Strike. And let's see, the only downside to her Tideweave armor was its higher mana demands. And she attempts the Fluffy Cloud mode again, and she is able to create really, really dense fog. But other than that, there's not a whole lot more to be done with it. And although Alestin's sitting on a paper chair, and it gets so soft from all the fog that it just crumbles, which I really did enjoy. Oh, sorry, in the chat, Dan says, Bierce must just note down all the names he comes up with when trying to name stuff for these conversations. It's fully what I expect. I bet, like, he bounces it around, maybe with, like, a friend or a significant other or something, and, you know, they're just having dinner, and he's like, all right, I have to name this thing. Hit me. And just starts to write them down. So then we have Sabae going to Alestin and asking how many people have died in the storms that her grandmother and Indris have created. And Alestin starts off with, now, be honest, like, do you actually want the answer to this question? And she says yes. And he says between 2,000 and 3,000, mostly from flooding. Official Havathi figures place the number much higher for propaganda reasons, of course. Now, I believe that the Havathi will lie. I really do. I do not trust them. But I would like to say, I just feel like something weird is up with them beyond what we're seeing. And I want to know what it is. It feels like granted, we already know they basically do want to replace Ithos. But, like, they haven't really addressed what that would look like in terms of the other great powers being taken out of the equation. And that's really my main concern. You know, I can understand where they're coming from, not trusting Kandaron and everything. I don't agree with them, but I get it. But I don't really see a big plan for a path forward. And that's where I'm, like, kind of hung up. And just being like, oh, you know, they say it's more for propaganda. Or, hear me out, you guys aren't being totally honest about how many it is. Like, you know, I'm not trying to accuse Alestin specifically of lying. I'm accusing kind of everybody of lying and being complicit in a lie. Because that's just sort of how things usually work. It's not one good side and one bad side. It's one side that's, like, doing their best but also full of flawed human beings, and another side that has worse ideas and also is full of flawed human beings. But yeah, she is, like, really affected by this. And he's like, maybe it's because you've been caught in the storms and you've experienced them and you know what it's like. And, you know, having been caught in them and knowing that they are under somebody's control makes it feel more real. And goes on to be like, look, this kind of power fucks you up in the head. It just does. There's just no way around it. And if you become a great power, you either keep playing the game and you keep growing in power, or you fucking die. And that's why I didn't want Talia to be part of this. Like, this is not something that you just get involved in lightly. You're committing your entire life to, like, striving. And, you know, it's going to come back and haunt you. And Sabae is like, do you really think there's no way out? And he says, I wish there were. But eventually everybody winds up falling prey to this, like, constant need to become more and more powerful. And he's like, and, you know, sometimes the storms are part of an actual attack. And Sabae's like, yeah, but they're Havathi civilians. They're not army. Is that fine? And Alestin says, well, I certainly think so. And I was like, wow, he is real cold-blooded when it comes to the Havathi. That's my main question is, like, I understand that they came after his family, but being cool with, like, Havathi civilians dying, it's more than just that. There's got to be a whole other part of this story. And it's sort of interesting to me how, like, everybody has been so affected by the fact that, oh, there were all these bones in Ithos of people who were trapped in there and died. And yes, sure. How many of those people are like aware what the Ithonians were doing though? Like, and are they complicit if they just keep living there and being part of a power and like enjoying the privilege of that when they know where that power is coming from? And this is like a broader question as well. You know, if a country who saw the US as just being a massive exploiter, you know, just for instance, and they just decided to like bomb all of us, we all live here, but we're not like, most of us don't have at our disposal the means to just leave. That's not an option, you know? So I don't know what the situation was in Ithos, and are those people able to just leave? Like, you know, that's my main question, is how culpable is everybody? So then he starts talking about the Havathi being, they're having like a drought, and this is due to the, you know, weather control, and that they are like starting to deal with shortages on some things and needing to work with like import stuff, like in a way that they haven't in the past, which Sabae says, well, that just seems like an inconvenience, not an attack. And Alestin says, that's the best way to kill an empire. Death by 10,000 cuts. You stretch their supply lines and trade routes to the brink. You force their coffers to hemorrhage gold with little raids, inconveniences, and infrastructure damage. You foment dissent at every level, even the lowest. It's only then that you deliver the final blow. And that really rang true for me, and is honestly the way that the U.S. has operated in a few, especially Central and South American countries that I could name. And it is really true. Like, it's also especially hard to recover after something like that. And it's just very, very gross. Honestly, the whole tactic, like, is, I understand it, but because I have the association of colonizers doing that to, countries that are full of, you know, brown people who are always being exploited already, I don't look favorably on it as a rule, just because of that association, even though I can understand practically that that is how to handle a thing. So anyway, when Sabae is like, well, why didn't Candoron handle Ithos that way? He says, if she had done it a century earlier, it would have survived. They would have been able to come back. And he starts talking about like how they were destroying the land because they were forcing farmers to use the same like farming techniques in places that it was not appropriate for the land. The capital grew more and more important in the chaos, and when Candoron used the splinter, the whole edifice simply collapsed. And yeah, I'm just saying, I feel like, yeah, yep. Dan is in the chat saying, feels like the USA is dying of paper cuts right now. Yeah, you know, like, you guys, I just want to just take this moment to be like, can we all just agree to start pushing for unions in every job out there? Because it is absolutely wild what we have put up with in terms of exploitation of workers. And recently, there's an eating disorder hotline that had like 2 paid workers, and the rest was an assortment of like 50 or 100 volunteers. And the paid workers, actually, I think it was like 4 of them, they unionized because they were being worked to the bone and they weren't hiring enough people, relying entirely on these volunteers. And the hotline fired them all. They unionized and they all lost their job. And the hotline became purely AI. It was just an AI responding to the messages of people looking for help. And it started recommending diet tips to the people getting in touch. And just like extremely triggering language for people who already have disordered eating. And eventually the AI was shut down and the group is looking at rehiring people. You know, like, how many times do we have to learn lessons like this? Like, what are we doing? I really want to know, what are we doing? Christ's sake. Anyway, so let's go to chapter 28, Needles. And fucking the Havathi, we have a lot of like small examples throughout these chapters of their attempts to like do various things to get through. And at one point they were trying to burrow underground, but considering that Kandaron has control of like the quartz in the ground, I feel like anything involving the earth is the opposite of what you want to do. And she crushes it. She doesn't even have to like go anywhere. She just does it from her lair. So anyway, they're all figuring out where they're going to have their spatial storage tattoos. And there is a choice between the blue of Kandaron's wings, like those crystals, or the green of Hugh's spell book. And of course, he was getting green to match his. Talia gets the blue because it's very close to the tattoos that she already has. It's not even going to be visible anyway, really. So it doesn't matter that much. But nevertheless, and I like the fact that at one point Alustin is sort of rolling his eyes at the fact that Hugh is getting one because it matches. And Arthur is like, how the fuck dare you, sir? You are the most vain, preening dude. Like, shut up. Stop it. He was so pissy when he couldn't get the yellow tattoos he wanted, which would have looked real dumb, by the way. And I did enjoy him checking Alustin on that. And we have this moment with Godric where he turns into a real cheaty for a second. That's a Good Place reference. Watch The Good Place, guys. But he's being asked what color, and he's like panicking and genuinely seems like completely unable to choose. And eventually Hugh chimes in that Mackerel wants him to get green, and he's like, okay, yeah, that's good. So he just makes the decision purely by that because he can't decide otherwise, which is a bit of info about him that I wasn't aware of, but I'm going to tuck that away. Having a difficult time making, like, not necessarily important decisions, but just, you know, maybe sort of petty decisions. Noted. So I was sort of wondering, because there's a mention of, I think it's Alustin being like, who do you think is going to complain about the pain the most? And I sort of wondered, are we going to get like a dark moment where people expect Hugh to be complaining and then he doesn't because he's been whipped so fucking much he doesn't see pain the same way anymore? But no, that doesn't really, it's just doesn't hurt as bad as he expected. And everybody is able to test their shit out pretty quickly. It's going to take an hour for the tattoos to actually disappear. So they have to stay hidden until then because she doesn't want to give away the secret about the tattoos. But they can test them out right away. And it really takes some practice because the whole, like, reaching into that space, because it's not technically in our reality, it feels weird and the angle is weird. So Hugh does a couple things and manages to start, like, actually getting objects into it. But it takes a few tries and it's very, it's like brain twisty, it seems like. But he's excited about it. And then we go to 29. I really enjoy Godric is storing rocks and thinks he's going to make into rocks. And he's like, and they don't even know because they've been teasing him about it. But he's like, no, genuinely, my shit is stuffed with rocks. I literally can't even like fit my head in there to see. And he is so distracted by all of this that Rana, who he was supposed to be meeting an hour ago, he like forgot about it. And Rana is the scent mage. And this is a really fun conversation because she finds him with her nose. And he's like, damn, you got a good sense of smell. And she's like, yeah, and you're going to also. It's going to be real easy too. But she asks him what he knows, and he tells her, and she's like, all right, so nothing. You're just getting like random spells, but you don't understand the theory. And he finally is like, yeah, I guess that's true. And she's like, okay, so tell me what a smell is. And I know this, you know, because I learned this in school, but I remember learning it. There was a girl in my class who, when she discovered that, like, you smell a fart because the bacteria in somebody's ass is, like, in the air now, basically, you guys, the look on her face, she looked like she was going to go bathe in bleach. Like, it was just a moment of complete dissociation. It's like, I can't accept that. I won't accept that. That is too horrifying. Which, yeah, you know, smells are bits of the thing that are coming off because things are, you know, solid is only solid insofar as we can touch it, but like at a molecular level, bits come off, things happen. So it's a really wild thing, and it is super gross, like when you really think about it at all. But also, it's what, for me, I am an excellent cook, and I put down my cooking being so good to my sense of smell. I have a really good sense of smell, which I'll tell you what, has not been awesome having adopted these puppies and now having cats that are spraying in response to dogs infringing on their turf. Not awesome. I wish I didn't have a sense of smell a lot of the time, I'll be honest. But it is like, if you guys ever are interested in just testing this out, it was something that I discovered like fairly early on and was like, oh my God, I love a good cup of like Earl Grey tea. And that in particular is a really fragrant tea because it has bergamot essence added to the tea leaves. And I would make this cup of tea and just savor it, usually at my desk. And then there was one day where I had to have my tea on the run. So I put it in one of those travel tumblers with a lid. And I got in the car and I'm driving and I take a sip. And I was like, what the fuck is wrong with my tea? This tastes weird. This isn't nearly as good. And eventually I got to my destination, took the lid off and was like, what's going on? And took a sip and I was like, oh no. Oh, it's fine. Oh, now it's good. And I realized that simply having the lid on dampened the fragrance of it so much that it tasted totally different and like 80% less good because I wasn't getting the full experience of it. And ever since then, if I'm going to be having like a drink for pleasure, I don't drink it with a lid on because that just ruins it. It just takes away so much of the enjoyment factor. So anyway, just recommending if you are somebody who gets coffees out, especially if you get like things that are heavily spiced or if, you know, whipped cream or foam or whatever, take the lid off and you will be amazed at how much more enjoyable it is and how much more of like a full sensory experience it is. Just saying. Anyway, so I just enjoyed this conversation a lot. And when she's describing like different types of scent affinity, one of them is for the actual substances floating in the air. It's the most common, and I think that's what you have. Instead of manipulating the actual substances, let's see. I actually trigger senses of smell on my own, scent illusions. And he's like, well, then how can your sense of smell be enhanced if it's not about the actual things in the air? And she's like, yeah, don't know, but it seems like all scent mages have a better sense of smell. And it also happens a lot for people who are born without a sense of smell. Anosmic, which I had never heard the word for that. Anosmic was not a familiar word to me. So yeah, she was born without a sense of smell to a clan that has like 60% rate of no sense of smell, but most of those people get a scent affinity. Like nature's making up for the fact, you know? And she also mentions how there's a lot of sound affinity among the deaf, but that light affinities are really rare among the blind, which, yeah, real curious and wondering if we're going to get any more information about why that is, or if we're just sort of leaving it there. So Godric is learning about this, and he is finding out about the etiquette that, like, first of all, you shouldn't reduce the smells of yourself around them, other scent mages, because it's considered like you trying to be stealthy, like you're trying to hide. And if you try and change, like, balance the smells of other people, obviously that's really rude. They're in the middle of this conversation. First, there are 3 other scent mages. At least 3 at Skyhold. And it says, at least there had been. All of the sent messages were weeks or months old. Rana didn't know who they might have been, nor had she tried particularly hard to find out. By the scent messages they'd left scattered throughout the mountain, she was guessing it was some espionage nonsense, and she wanted absolutely none of it, which I'm like, word? Scent messages. Desperate to know how that works. And then they are being eavesdropped on, and we had already seen that he was being eavesdropped on by some of Talia's family when he was talking to his father about like the mana thing. And this time, Rana is the one who, like, catches them because she can smell them. And it's Rafe and Tristan. And Tristan is flirting very much with Arthur. Oh, my God. So sorry, Godric. That's really rude. Flirting with Godric. But they ask him, and we don't find out what this is. But they're like, so we know that you're trying to power up here. And are you familiar with elementals? And they tell him the thing. It says the idea was utterly and completely insane. It was dangerously irresponsible, highly risky, and frankly a bit stupid. And Godric is like 100% on board. And then, as he's agreeing to it, the Havathi raise a ward abruptly out of nowhere, and it starts to spread pretty quickly. And it connected to its origin point, leaving Skyhold and the leagues around it surrounded by an impossibly huge ward wall. It was translucent, and Godric could make out the endless erg beyond it to a small degree, but it was far harder to see through than Skyhold's ward. I am real curious about what they're doing here, but this feels like a real bad thing. Feels like bad news. Don't love it. And considering the way that it's been talked about, like, you know, we can just death by 1,000 cuts, make things inconvenient until the whole edifice falls. Can they do something to Skyhold has so much, they have so many supplies in place to deal with the siege. But there was one small mention at one point about how nobody was too concerned about the water supply because they had a spring or something. And now I'm like, oh man, are they doing something to that? Or is like, you know, I'm trying to think of a particular thing that would like be specifically outside of what Kandaron has affinity for. I don't know. So, okay, now we go to chapter 30. And this is really interesting. So, Hugh is with his kids that he's like mentoring, and they're all making lists of the, you know, creatures that they're thinking about pacting with. And we're getting more information about some of these other ones. There's this moment. The first one is Stilvarek Steelchitin, a gargantuan centipede well over 200 feet in length. Despite their horrific appearance, Stilvarek is quite peaceful, and I was just like, that is so rude. Can you imagine if you were just, like, described as being horrific looking, and then it being like, and I know because it's so horrible looking, you would assume it was an aggressive, violent monster, but it's actually chill. Ouch! Okay. Wow. How about you just cool it a little bit there, bruh? Like, that felt real judgmental. Mean. Stop it. Anyway, we also hear about the Thunderclaw, which is technically, like, self-aware, but only to the degree of, like, a little, like, 3 or 4-year-old, which sounds like a pure nightmare, and apparently only refers to itself in the third person, which I always love. I always find that really, really funny. So then we have this, like, well, real quick, Venta is wanting to run her list by Sabae. Of course. Trying to be, like, cool about it, but I'm like, you're not fooling anybody, girl. But then we have this moment with Thaddeus. And Thaddeus is the one that keeps, like, interrupting, and it just sort of is hyperactive. And he had managed to stay quiet long enough that he was able to deal with his other students. And Hugh says that out loud. And Thaddeus is kind of crushed and is like, you don't really like me, huh? And this is a really great moment because I really, like, first of all, I think probably a lot of us have had a moment where we realize a teacher didn't like us. And if you are a kid that's sort of motivated by, like, validation from authority figures, finding out a teacher doesn't like you can be really, really crushing. And especially, like, I had this happen with a teacher that I really did like. And the moment that I realized that the teacher that I thought was sort of an exceptional teacher, that I realized that he did not like me, was particularly awful. But they have a kind of moment where Hugh is like, all right, you know what? I'm not going to just try and reassure this kid. No, of course I don't dislike you. I'm going to be honest with him. And he's like, look, I have a real difficult time dealing with people. And my energy levels on that are always pretty low. And you require so much of that energy that I find you really draining. And it's very difficult for me. And I really appreciated it because I have this with some friends of mine, and they're like friends who I love and I care about, but they are a lot. And it can be really tough for me to engage because I have to shift into a different version of myself in order to cope and get the energy together. And I am not always able or in the headspace to do that, you know? And I think a lot of you probably get what I mean, where you have some friends that you could just show up and talk to in exactly the fucking headspace you're at. And they are also there with you. And you feel no need to adjust. You don't need to put on an act. There's no requirement of, like, shift. It's just we are eye to eye and there is no labor involved. And then you have friends that it's a different kind of relationship. And I really get this, you know? So this Thaddeus says, I'm sorry, I know I can be difficult to deal with and I don't want to be, but I don't know how not to be. Which is a really tricky thing. Like, knowing that you just have a personality that's tough, like, you basically, you're like, I have to figure out how to change my personality. Like, that fucking sucks to hear, you know? And there are certain things that it's like, okay, this is just a matter of politeness and being considerate. For example, him constantly interrupting. That is the sort of thing where maybe that's not so much your personality. Maybe that is thoughtlessness. Maybe you do need to learn to like think before you speak and consider the other people in the room who want to hear what Hugh has to say. And then there are some things that it's like, this is maybe just part of who you are, and it's not something you can change. And you have to sort of like navigate that and figure out what is immutable and what are simply side effects of some of your like major unchangeable characteristics that you can maybe manage a little bit better. But yeah, he sounds like he's got like really bad ADD, you know? And Hugh is, honestly, it's funny because sometimes people like this and people like Hugh really, really can gravitate towards each other. This is how I am with Rashawn. I can be very, very outgoing, and Rashawn is very, very low energy with people. And we get along really well in some ways because of that, you know? But, anyway, so then we have this moment where Mackerel comes in and he's got Alustin's shoe. And apparently Mackerel was sent to deliver a note to Alustin, which he didn't. So when Hugh asks about it, he just spits it at Alustin like absentmindedly, like, oh yeah, right here. And this whole thing is so weird. So Alustin is like, all right, what is this? And Hugh is like, well, they were asking about contract partners, and I don't know anything about spirits. So I am running out of time here once again. I'm going to really try and speed it up here. But he's talking about how far back spirits like go, and they exist mostly in the ether, and a lot of minds can't exist within that space. He thinks about the cold minds, but doesn't say anything. And Hugh is like, yeah, don't mention that. They're real freaky. But he says they're living mana structures jutting out of the ether. And I think that sounds wild. And I totally understood what he meant. Like they're of the ether. That's where they live. But they can just about come out and like affect the real world. And it doesn't like a person's whole mind isn't there anymore. So it's just like essential nature and the parts of them that made it, that they either maybe considered important enough or that were so essential to their personality that it stuck. It's just a really weird, the whole concept of this, I am really interested to see more of, and I am wondering how this ties in because it's elementals that they talked about with what they're experimenting with on Godric's like scent affinity. So how is that going to work, you know? And when that is mentioned, he just rolls his eyes and is like, that is such a bad idea. I really don't think they should do that, but guess they're gonna. So let's see. Spirits tend to be much, much rarer than liches, largely because few mages want to become partial husks of themselves in that way. The failure rate is also a lot higher among those who do try, hence the larger number of elementals than spirits. So yeah, that sounds kind of cool. And Kana says, that sounds as good as a warlock partner to me. I don't really like the idea of making a pact with some great power that might upend my life entirely on a whim. So I was thinking about trying to pact with an enchanted item like the Sacred Swordsman, but pacting with a spirit based around a purpose I agree with sounds pretty good to me. And Hugh is like, all right, Kana, shit, because she's like apparently a real quiet student. She's just out here being like, ideals, yo. And he's like, okay, you know what? And also the fact that she's like, oh yeah, pacting with a great power that might fuck your life up. And he's like, I don't know anything about that. What do you mean? Sorry, Hugh. Sucks to suck. So then we get chapter 31, and this is the scene, and I'm so sorry that I'm like so out of time here, but I'll probably also talk about this next time if I don't get to say everything here. But Talia she's been training so much she hasn't seen her friends a lot, and she's like expecting to see Hugh at the next class, I think it's, cryptography, which is one that he really likes. And she expects him to be there and he's not. So she goes and tracks him down. And he is like on his bed face down, which I fucking feel him on this. And he is telling her, it's too much. I have no time alone. I have no time to see you guys. Like, when's the last time we've done anything for fun? We are just out here fucking having like all kinds of crises, and people are stopping me in the hall that I don't even know and asking me kind of personal fucking questions. Like, I don't want to talk to them. And every time that anything comes up, it's like I'm being pulled in two directions. I just wish I could go back to nobody knowing who I am. And she's like, okay, but do you, like, really? Because you weren't happy. And he's like, no, but I do wish that I had more time to just be me. And I feel real powerless a lot. Like, my thing with my lungs, that's fucking me up. But also, this siege, like, I don't feel like anything I do really matters in the context of this huge thing that's happening. And then calls himself a burden again. And Talia is like, yo, I feel like we've talked about this. So, you're not gonna say that. And she starts tickling him to get him to sort of like kind of break out of this moment. And when he's like, I was being serious, she's like, no, but I am too. You can't say those things about yourself. And everybody is feeling powerless. That's sort of the thing about a siege, is that you literally can't do anything. They are surrounding you and you can't really move or respond. And also, you're letting people into your life. And when you do that, you make yourself vulnerable and find out, oh, I can't protect everybody, which sucks to realize. And honestly, that is the thing, you know, like the more you care, the more potential there is to be hurt. And that is why some people think like, oh, I just won't care and then I can't get hurt. And it's like, lol, or that's what's hurting you, you know, whatever. And then she's like, what about after all this going on an adventure? And I was sort of like, I don't know, that sounds like the opposite of what he would want. But he seems kind of intrigued. And I was just sort of like, or what if you just like, you know, went to a cabin somewhere and chilled and played Xbox for like a weekend? I don't feel like adventures, when he's talking about being pulled in a million directions and doing everything being too much. I'm just saying. Anyway. And I do like the one where she's like, and you can pay for us and then we can be burdens. And he's like, you guys are never burdens. And you're all my family. And she's like, oh, it's so wild that you just said that, because that's literally what I've been saying to you this whole time. So how about you just shut the fuck up? And he's like, oh, that's fair. Yeah. And the chapter ends with her being like, I'm going to go get my skeleton tattooed. And he's like, God, oh my God, that's today. And I am just like, I know that it's probably not going to be as horrible as I imagine, but that still sounds like a fucking nightmare, and no thank you. Pass. But yeah, I really understand he's feeling on this, like just the overwhelm, you know, as somebody with anxiety, fucking, I get it. So anyway, all right, guys. But yeah, these were good chapters. I just wish that I really tried. I really tried to stay on task, and I mostly did, but I still ran out of time. Anyway, appreciate you all a lot. And thank you, Dan. Welcome to capitalism, says Dan. Fucking everything comes back to that, doesn't it? Until next time. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.